please.
Cool. Good morning, colleagues from the media and everyone who has joined our press conference from our social media platforms. As is customary around this time, the DA presents its alternative budget. So for the purpose of that business, today we are joined by our team finance, the Shadow Minister of Finance, Dion George, and our Deputy Shadow Minister of Finance, Ashor Sarupen, both of whom will be outlining the DA's proposals in terms of our alternative budget. Dion, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. Today we present the DA's Alternative Medium-Term Budget Policy Statement, MTBPS, for 2022. Amidst a government-induced economic crisis of more debt, slow growth, record unemployment, unreliable energy, and the rapidly rising cost of living, our economy can be rescued and placed on a path to recovery and growth. Our alternative MTBPS sets out how we can achieve this. South Africa's post-pandemic recovery has been underperforming on many fronts. Our economy finds itself trapped in a manufactured, self-reinforcing vicious cycle of high government budget deficits, unstable energy supply, declining foreign and local private capital formation, declining levels of GDP per capita, uncertainty on private property rights, poor national and local governance, and a vast, poorly run public sector dominated by monopolistic state enterprises. The necessary economic reforms require bold policy choices from the Minister. The DA's alternative budget in February 22 proposed a fiscal policy platform that would direct South Africa's economic recovery towards virtuous growth to generate more jobs, reduce public debt, raise living standards, attract foreign and local investment, and alleviate the disproportionate impact of rising inflation on the most vulnerable in our society through responsible fiscal management. The DA's 2022 alternative MTBPS presents how a DA government will establish a base to accelerate economic growth by reforming state-owned enterprises for private investment and relieving the economy of anti-poor policies, reverse the upward debt spiral by containing debt and managing expenditure, fight the high cost of living to protect vulnerable South Africans by introducing a conditional basic income grant, increasing support for small, medium and micro enterprises, and reducing taxes by cutting the fuel levy and removing VAT from an expanded food basket. Fight corruption by bolstering the capabilities of institutions that combat organized and sophisticated crime. To realize the above set of expectations, the Minister must from the outset place an emphasis on achieving fiscal sustainability by ensuring that South Africa remains on course to achieve the fiscal targets set in the 2022 February budget. I will now hand over to Ashor, who will be speaking about resilient economic growth.
Thank you very much, Dion. And so the structural weaknesses in the South African economy is that it's severely constrained in its ability to respond to growing international uncertainty. Without deregulation, the rigid policy environment which inhibits economic activity, building economic resilience will not be attainable, and inflation will continue to surge. The rate of unemployment will continue to spiral upwards, and economic growth, if any, will remain slow, if at all positive. So the first thing we propose is no more bailouts for state-owned entities. Continuous bailouts for state-owned enterprises have financed failing entities' debt services, salaries, and current spending on suppliers. Apart from the contribution to employee consumption, there is no perceivable value-added growth and development in sectors where these entities operate. Minister Godongwana must therefore remain firm on his pledge not to reprioritize budget items to bail out failing SOEs. On energy security and load shedding, uncertain energy supply coupled with an unstable political environment has drastically impacted the development of South Africa and severely limited our economic growth potential. There has been much talk regarding the solutions with Africa's energy crisis. But after 15 years of load shedding, which is half of my adult life so far, living under energy supply, not enough has been done. So based on this grim energy outlook, The DA reiterates its call for the privatization of Eskom and the opening up of the energy sector to independent power producers, as continued state ownership of the entity has not served to benefit anyone, least of all the poor. And we reject any plan to transfer Eskom's debt onto the national balance sheet. It creates a moral hazard. On BEE as a failed policy, we must accept that as a developing country with a massive labor force at its disposal, South Africa should be experiencing continuous, virtuous economic growth. Instead, race-based labor market legislation has facilitated corruption, elite enrichment, and unskilled cadre deployment on an industrial scale. The South African economy and its citizens, especially the poor, have borne the consequences of this distorted labor system. By excluding the full participation of those who are capable, our economy has become far less efficient and productive than it could be. The next thing we suggest is to reduce the gross national debt. And we expect that the 2022 MTBPS must provide a fiscal framework that is focused on reducing the deficit while stimulating growth through responsible spending. To ensure that this approach is sustainable, it is important that South Africa urgently addresses the interdependent challenges of a high debt burden, increased deficit spending, and low economic growth. Through the implementation of the DA's economic policy framework, we are able to show how we would bring the national debt under control at an accelerated pace and consolidate South Africa's fiscal position sooner than the ANC government by generating sufficient economic growth. And then in managing government expenditure, the increase in the debt and deficit spending did not result in increased spending on infrastructure and capital formation. Instead, government salaries, specifically the 30,000 millionaire manager class, ballooned beyond what can be considered sustainable and justifiable. I will now hand over back to Dr. George to speak about support for the vulnerable.
Thanks very much, Ashor. We need to support vulnerable South Africans. Poor and vulnerable South Africans continue to shoulder most of the economic burden caused by a sluggish post-pandemic recovery. This is compounded by unstable international conditions and hostile government policies that discourage economic participation and increase living costs. The DA's intricate policy reform framework enables the financing for the rollout of a vast and sustainable social welfare net. It does so not by spending lavishly, but through generating economic growth that is guided by the DA's policy. The DA will provide conditional direct income support for the most vulnerable in our society. It will pay for this by accelerating economic growth and generating the necessary revenue. Government seeks to position the provision of a basic income grant as an either-or. If it is to provide the grant, it will argue that taxes, especially VAT, must increase. This is a trade-off because government has mismanaged the people's money and is unable to self-correct its corruption-riddled behavior. If government implements the requisite policies to spur economic growth and contain debt, a basic income grant becomes viable. If the grant is not funded by growth, the large immediate expansion of social transfers would threaten fiscal sustainability and lead to significant employment losses by actually decreasing economic activity and growth. The DA can budget for the introduction of a conditional universal basic income grant at 585 Rand per month for adults between the ages of 19 and 59. The grant would be made available on the understanding that it would only be provided when revenue generated from GDP growth is available, as would be the case given the implementation of the DA's policy framework. We need to support small, medium and micro enterprises. If government seeks to alleviate poverty and inequality, the best steps to take are in the direction of reducing the cost of living and creating conditions that are favorable to plentiful employment. This is particularly relevant to the SMME sector. This approach requires an environment of low-cost compliance with regulations, low tax rates, low cost of transactions, and reasonable transport costs. It also requires a transparent marketplace that isn't dominated by politically dominant cartels and subservient to cartels, government agencies. The DA will not support any increases in taxes. Our alternative budget in February 2022 set out several proposals for tax relief. Given the current cost of living emergency, tax on fuel and an expanded zero-rated VAT food basket must be considered now and not deferred until February 2023. We have proposed that the zero-rated food basket be expanded to include bone-in chicken, beef, tinned beans, wheat flour, margarine, peanut butter, baby food, tea, coffee, and soup powder. We must commit to the bolstering of corruption-busting institutions. Corrupted economies are not able to function properly because the very nature of corruption disturbs the market and thereby prevents the natural laws of the economy from functioning freely. Given the billions that have been directed towards bailing out dysfunctional state-owned enterprises, the 2022 medium-term budget policy statement and 23 budget provide the perfect opportunities for the Minister to direct funds that have been misappropriated and wasted throughout other ministerial departments towards law enforcement agencies that combat specialized and organized crime, such as corruption, money laundering, and terrorist financing. This is especially urgent following the Financial Action Task Force report that identified significant shortcomings in South Africa's financial system in combating money laundering and preventing the flow of funds for the financing of terrorism. South Africa faces the real prospect of grey listing in February 2023, and this will present even more hardship for struggling South African households. In conclusion, our economy is in crisis, and households are now facing the devastating consequences of decades of government mismanagement of the public finances. The cost of living is spiralling upward, while government remains fixated on its hopelessly failed economic model. There is no silver bullet, and the South African economy is surrounded by endless opportunities and possibilities. If we do not divert from the disastrous path that government has paved, we will never see the growth rates we are so capable of reaching. And the people of South Africa will never become everything that they are capable of becoming. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much, Dion and Ashor. I just want to establish, are there questions from the media in here? I see a hand in that event. Just for everyone's purposes, introduce your name and your media house and the questions, and then they'll be able to respond.
Yes, Linda Ensel from Business Day. I've got 3 questions. Your reasons why Eskom debt should not be taken onto the government balance sheet. The cost of your 585 basic income grant, and if it's dependent on revenue, that becomes very unstable and uncertain. What's your response to that? And the third one is, yes, economic growth. You know, your whole program relies on a mythical economic growth, will take some time to achieve. So it's a very long-term view on which you base very short-term measures. So if you could respond to that, thanks.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, colleagues.
Okay, I'll start off and then Ashor can add on if you'd want to. On Eskom's debt, yes, we have said that we will not support the transfer of Eskom's debt onto the national balance sheet. And there are several reasons for it. When we met with the World Bank and the IMF when they were in South Africa, we had a discussion on Eskom's debt.
When was that, sorry?
This was a number of months ago.
Okay.
Yeah, a number of months ago, but it was recent.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've explained is that investors across the world will tell you how much they love Eskom's debt because it's got higher yields and it is virtually guaranteed by government. So what has happened is there's been a massive appetite for this debt. Eskom has been getting more and more debt and wasting more and more, so there's no incentive not to. And now investors are getting nervous because Eskom is not viable. So we're not saying that you must pull the blanket out of Eskom. We're saying that you need a transformation of Eskom. We've said it before. So if you take the debt from Eskom and you put it onto the national balance sheet, you introduce a massive amount of moral hazard because nothing stops Eskom then to say, well, great, or the investors, great. It's now guaranteed by government actually, and we can just They can just carry on borrowing, and then we can carry on making our yields at the expense of the most vulnerable South Africans, because what's happening is we already have interest that's crowding out the ability to provide services. So this will just carry on going. So you have a debt spiraling already. You're going to put more debt onto the balance sheet. There is simply not enough fiscal space. So from an economic perspective, it is not sensible. What is sensible is if you take Eskom, as we have proposed, do not create Eskom 2. That's where you want to start. Do not create another one, because that won't work. Take Eskom, inject the private sector into it, have partnerships, make it more economically sustainable and viable, specifically from the financial perspective. That's a place to start already. And then you unbundle in terms of generation. So that is possible. We have a plan, but simply taking the debt and putting onto the national balance sheet does not make any economic sense. We'll see what the minister has to say tomorrow, but I think that he's probably going to be talking about that, because what he's already doing is he's sensitizing everybody out there that, oh, this is absolutely necessary or else we're going to have no lights. So that, of course, we don't buy. Then on the cost of the basic income grant, it is pricey. We've calculated at, if it's 585 Rand a month, it would be about 232 billion Rand it would cost. Now, as I've said many times before, South Africa is not a poor country. We're a poor country because our government has been mismanaging our public finances for decades. That's the problem. So and it ties into your third question about this mythical economic growth. We actually do have enormous potential for economic growth in South Africa. Government must just need to focus on what it's supposed to do. Create the infrastructure, provide healthcare, provide education, provide support for vulnerable people, provide energy or support energy provision, make sure we have water, and the basic things, make sure the ports work so that we can get fuel here, and then get out of the way. And let entrepreneurs and let business do what they do best. There is reason why people actually do things, and that's they respond to incentive. That's what government needs to do on a macro scale. On the basic income grant, what's happening now is government is positioning it most likely as an either-or. So they will say, there is no money. There is no money. Why? It's because so much has been wasted. There is no fiscal space, and it shouldn't be like that. They will then say, if we're going to have a basic income grant, we're going to have to put up taxes, and the easiest tax to put up is VAT, because it does reach everybody, because we know not everybody is in the tax net. So that's how they will position it, but it's a completely false narrative. There is no such thing as having to have a comparison. We have done the numbers, and you'll see at the back of your pack, where we have projected a very minor 4.8% growth, economic growth, which is doable.
4.8.
4.8 is doable. Not now, absolutely not. We probably might get nothing positive. We might even be negative. But we are able to move that way. And as you move that way, you get more revenue, and that you have more space to move in the fisc. So I think also the DA's view has always been, we are not going to be stuck in the mindset of, well, everything is broken, we're in a difficult situation, and there is nowhere to go. No, we actually do have a plan, we have a viable one, and we will continue to process there. The problem is that government wants to position itself at the center of our economy when it is dysfunctional. That is the problem. If you just merely move government out the way, you have a better result. Ashor, I'm sure you'd like to.
Sure. So I think, Linda, on the matter of the Eskom debts, Treasury in 2019 produced a strategy document to get the economy moving again, if you recall. And one of their proposals at that point was the unbundling of Eskom, and they warned against moving the debt to the balance sheet. And their suggestion in that document was actually to sell off generating capacity and for the state to hang on to the grid. So this is not something that people haven't been warning. This Treasury's own technocrats have been warning against moving debt to the balance sheet for a very long time. And I strongly urge everyone in the press to pull up Treasury's own 2019 growth strategy document and have a look at their proposals around that, and the controversy from certain people around arguing that the Treasury wants a fire sale on generating capacity. But the reality is that the collapse in generating capacity has been forecast a very long time ago. And it was even seen, the problems we have now was even seen in 2019. On the uncertainty around the basic income grant, the simple reality is that when you begin to grow the economy and you get more people into work, the other thing that comes with that is that you have more fiscal space, you've got fewer people dependent on public services, and then you can actually afford more and more of that. But I don't think it's fair to describe growth as mythical, and I understand it's been a long time since we got to 5% growth. I was in matric the last time the country had 5% economic growth. But there are a couple of things. The first is government misspending and corruption has deterred investment, made South Africa unattractive. You deal with that, and you can all attract investment. Energy uptime is a huge constraint to growth. Getting consistent, reliable energy across this economy would spur growth already because of all of the hours of productivity lost and a low productivity economy already. And one of the causes of our poor productivity is, of course, energy availability. And lastly, fixed capital formation. We know that all through South Africa's economic history, and even if you look at Singapore, the Asian tigers, growth in emerging markets tracks gross fixed capital formation very, very closely. And if you look at the 2005 boom and that period, the gross fixed capital formation rates in the GDP was above 20%. When it dips below 20% in our economy, that's when we begin to see stagnation. So there's a lot of correlation between that. And over the last decade, we saw the state borrow a lot of money in international markets, not to invest in gross fixed capital formation, but rather in salaries and unproductive spending. And if you were to rebalance that back towards fixed investment, you could spur growth again.
Thanks, Ashor. Do you have any follow-up before I go on to? Okay, thanks. We have also received some questions from media on our social media platforms. It's basically two. One is about the number of zero-based items that we've called for them to be increased. Is that affordable? That is the question. And how do you plan to make it affordable? And secondly, there's a big emphasis on reducing government debt. Why is that the reason there's such a big emphasis on it?
On the zero-based items, or the expansion of the basket, we did have expert advice in putting that basket together. I did raise the issue in Parliament in question time. I asked the Minister whether he would cut that on the basket, and he said that he would, if I asked him, he would subject it to expert analysis. I've written a letter to him, and I'm expecting something to happen on that. I certainly will be pursuing him on that. We've calculated it approximately 1.5 billion rand if we are going to cut VAT on those items. That is not an enormously large amount of money, given if you look at the size of the fisc, for example, if you look at government wasting, for example, that is very much affordable. What is needed is that government needs to be more efficient in how it manages the money. So we believe that it is very much doable. And also, if you look at what the consequences of that would be, if you get more protein into the brains of developing children, they are actually better off in the long run, in terms of education, in terms of opportunity. And we believe that the effect that would have on the health system in the longer run and the productivity of our economy very much outweighs the cost that you would have to bear on that. So it is very much doable. And as we've said before, we've done the modelling. It is possible to cut the VAT on this expanded basket and provide a conditional basic income grant. There is enough space if you manage the economy well enough. On the government debt, we know that the more debt you have, the more interest you need to pay. And that is something that takes a long time. So if we look over the next 3 years, there's a very significant amount of money, and it's growing, and it's crowding out service delivery. And that's the issue. So you do not want to have more debt because you're paying money for something that you're not getting any value from, especially if you're using the debt for consumption expenditure. If you borrow money and you build a bridge or you build a road or something, you have a longer term benefit, and that's a slightly different issue. But government has been borrowing for consumption expenditure because it hasn't been able to balance the budget because it's been overspending on the wrong things, especially bailouts to state-owned enterprises that have delivered nothing to our economy. That's why we believe government debt should reduce. And if you look at government's own projections, if you add Eskom's mountain of debt onto the current debt we have, it is not sustainable.
Ash, do you want to have some final remarks?
Yeah. So on the VAT list, we must remember that the state has found a whole lot of money over the years to bail out state-owned enterprises and all sorts of other emerging pressures. And in the budget, there is something called the 10 billion rand contingency reserve. And whenever the post office needs money or SABC because they've mismanaged themselves, they're just going to empty out this contingency reserve. I would argue that at this point in time, that the fiscal space does exist for expanding the VAT list. And as Dion says, it's a investment into the people of this country to ensure that they have adequate nutrition, and that can only be a good thing. Why the focus on government debt? Well, look at the calamity in the United Kingdom when you don't show that you're serious about containing government debt and you think you can blow up deficits. It's not sustainable, and the markets and the investors will respond. Long-term investment into our economy will become dependent on the state demonstrating that it can control its debt.
Thanks very much, Ashor and Dion and Linda, for coming to the presser. And thanks everyone who also joined through our social media platforms. Enjoy your day.